a question. I'll pose a question to each of you. They'll be slightly different. So for Professor Loayza, Rafael, all right, you've shown some very strong correlations between auto-identifiers, self-identifiers, ethnic self-identifiers, and the vote for Evo. But Evo is not the first indigenous candidate for the presidency. You're certainly not the first indigenous leader in the country. I can think of, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
I can think of Victor Hugo Cárdenas in the 90s, but maybe someone much more polemic, Felipe Quispe, who definitely made ethnic appeals, right? Perhaps exclusive ethnic appeals, but ethnic appeals. So why is it that Evo is the one that successfully attracts that vote when past political leaders, some more prominent than others, were not as successful? So that's my question for Rafael. And then I'll ask questions to Dr. Madrid, and then I'll let you go ahead. So in terms of the policies that he's put into place, and some of these indigenous policies that he's put into place, and a lot of them sound very good. The plurinational state sounds very good. We're recognizing that there are people who identify as Bolivian, but identify as Aymara, identify as Guarani, identify as other types. We recognize that. We want to respect those rights and traditions. We want to respect your customs. I'm going to promote the education of indigenous languages and promote learning about these different cultures, these different nations. So one thing is the symbolism of all that. But then the other thing is how you sort of actually practice what you preach, right? So there's been a lot of criticism from many of Evo's supporters, Luis Tapia and others, who say, I don't know what a plurinational state means in practice, because some of the laws, some indigenous, for example, in terms of law enforcement and communitarian justice versus state justice, they conflict in terms of how you, for example, prosecute somebody who's been accused of stealing. Have there been resources channeled to promoting indigenous languages in schools? So to what extent has there been some sort of effort to, do you think, to actually put some money, some resources, attempt to implement some of these policies? And to what extent, if it hasn't happened, will those kinds of appeals eventually lose their attraction? We'll start with both those. Go ahead.
I'll start. Okay. That's a very good question, Jennifer. And let me answer saying this. Well, it was a matter of time, and I think that democracy, when it was really consolidated in 1982 with Presidente Hernán Siles, it started to provide certain, how can I say, spaces of participation for indigenous. Before that, the poverty, for example, was one of those issues that was undermining the possibility of the indigenous to participate in politics. But the most important aspect of this is that in 1985, Paz Tensoro, in 1993, Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada did the Ley de Participación Popular, which started to provide the possibility of governance in the municipalities to indigenous groups. La Ley de Participación Popular was extended to education as well, letting the indigenous to learn in their mother languages, in Aymara and Quechua, and the constitution was changed as not as just a Republic of Bolivia, but as a multicultural and plurinational state in 1993. The paradox is that this was made by Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada, which is the first enemy of Evo Morales. And I think since the Participación Popular up to 2003, to La Guerra del Gas, this identity was started to be politicized. And thanks to Victor Hugo Cárdenas, you talked about him. He was not a president candidate, but he was vice president of Bolivia, of Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada, or Felipe Quispe. The way was open for indigenous chances to become presidents. I mean, before that, before Víctor Hugo Cárdenas, before Felipe Quispe, it was unthinkable to have in the ballot to any indigenous. So I think this was a process that ended in 2003 with the collapse of the neoliberalism, that since the beginning of this period of democracy in 1982, the democracy was weak. We never have a candidate that won for majority until Evo Morales. We were learning somehow to use this democracy, and government by government, regime by regime, we're providing new rights to indigenous, like those from Participación Popular, like the change of the Constitution of 1991, for instance. So I think this was a process. Before the 80s, we didn't have democracy. Before that, in the National Revolution, the indigenous didn't have the right to vote. And I think this was an accumulation of factors that ended in this eruption of social eruption that almost reaped the election of Evo Morales in 2003 with the social unrest that everyone knows about. I think it was a process.
All right, so I'm going to actually start by responding to the question that you posed to Rafael,
okay,
and then some comments that he made, and then I'll answer the other question. So I think Rafael and I agree on a number of things. So certainly we agree that Evo Morales and the MAS have done much, much better in indigenous areas than in non-indigenous areas. That's not unquestionable when you look at the provincial, municipal level data that I've analyzed in my book as well. And certainly a large part of his appeal is ethnic to indigenous people. That said, and I've analyzed the individual level data from surveys, etc., that show that Morales not only he does best among indigenous people, but, for example, in 2005, he won 51% of the votes of the people who self-identified as mestizos, according to the LAPOP survey. Latin American Republic. He won 30% of the vote of the people who self-identified as white. So when you look at the individual level data, even though there is a very high correlation between the percentage of indigenous people in an area and the vote for Evo Morales, that doesn't mean that whites and mestizos aren't voting for Morales too. In the same way that there is a very high correlation between the African American population in a particular precinct and the vote for Democrats, but obviously a lot of non-African Americans are voting for Democrat as well. I'd also point out there also have been some recent indigenous presidents candidates like Loayza, who have not done well among the population. So I do think that while a very important part of Evo's appeal to indigenous people is the fact that he is indigenous, that's not all of it. I think there are other important parts as well. And I do think that Evo, we know from survey data that Evo has in fact won significant shares of the vote of people who have identified as white or mestizo. In terms of your question about, the policies sound really good. We've declared Bolivia a plurinational state. What does this mean in practice? Well, not always that much. I mean, this is a recurring theme in Latin America that policies look a lot better on paper than in practice. That is, they have all these grandiose, a lot of constitutions say, oh, well, do all these things, but in practice they're not implemented or they're not enforced. And that has been true to a certain extent with some of these policies. So territorial autonomy, self-governance, it's been a very slow process. I was just reading an article on the plane ride over about how slow it's been in actually implementing these policies. And I think the same to a degree is true in the schools and in terms of the education system. Yes, there have been some changes, but they've been slow coming.
I have a question. I like to learn more about the people that are within the indigenous populations that are very heterogeneous. There has been some change. It's not homogeneous, their support, and important actors have been going against Evo, like especially after Tipnis and Itikawasu, with the extraction of natural resources and then the national park Tipnis. So to what extent are they organized group, or what are they doing now? What do we know about them? Are they a threat within yeah?
This can be a question for both of you.
It's for both. You go first, it's easier, I think.
Sure. Well, do they represent a threat? They don't. It doesn't help. It doesn't help to have an organization like CONAMAC criticizing Evo, saying they're going to run a candidate against him. It doesn't help Evo to have certain members of the MAS, like Senator Nino Vinca, coming out against him, leaving the party, denouncing him. But that said, do they represent a real threat? I don't think so. I think Evo still commands the support of most indigenous people. That is, it's that even when these other indigenous leaders peel off from him and criticize him and all that, yes, he takes a blow, but his popularity is such that I don't think it's a real risk to his electoral chances.
Yeah, I agree with Professor Madrid, and I don't think the indigenous of the lowland represent a threat for Evo Morales for merely one reason. They're just 70% of the population, nothing more. The majority are Aymaras, 25%, and Quechuas, 30%. So when Aymaras and Quechua vote for Evo Morales, 9 out of 10, it doesn't matter if the indigenous of the lowland are against him, because they don't represent more than 7% of the population. And even though they are very politicized, they held support not within the indigenous, because most of indigenous are not living in their lands. Most of the indigenous are colonizers in the lower lands. And when Evo Morales wanted to build that road, he was not thinking on the indigenous of the lowlands, but he was really caring of the indigenous migrating from the highlands. So believe me, whether this was a scandal because he was showing that Evo Morales was doing policy against indigenous interest, the indigenous Aymaras and Quechuas are very thankful for him for that road whenever it's going to be built. Going back to the little debate we're starting to have with Professor Madrid, yes, of course, mestizos and blancos vote for Evo Morales, but not in huge numbers. 10% of mestizos and blancos vote for Evo Morales, but it's not relevant compared to the 90% that votes against Evo Morales. And this was very interesting in the last election of governor in Departamento del Beni. Departamento is like you have states in the USA. Evo Morales expended $3 million. He tried to find a candidate. It was a woman, former Miss Bolivia. She was Spanish descended. She was from the elites of El Beni, because the majority of the population in El Beni are not indigenous. And he lost. He lost because, and he just held 32% of the vote. If you look at the numbers, you will find out that ethnicity in El Beni is 32%. And non-indigenous in El Beni are almost 60%. So it doesn't matter if Evo Morales make alliances with the elites, with the white elites. He is having the non-indigenous against him in every election.
I have a question. Perhaps naive, I'm an anthropologist, not a political scientist. But this is for Rafael and then also for Raúl as the part two, is how in your co-correlation between ethnicity and votes, you were able to disarticulate class, given that I think somebody said 96%, 98% of indigenous people are poor. And I say that because also within these presentations, people talked about things like, perhaps he's not putting in a socialist government in terms of relations of production, but agrarian reform, water rights, policies to keep kids in school, literacy campaigns, health campaigns, kind of the bread and butter of people who have been exploited in your own historical frame for centuries. I think that's got to matter. It isn't just a matter of, oh boy, we might say talk Amara in school, or we might wave a symbol of indigenous identity. I think those are important to indigenous peoples, but I'm not sure this is the whole story. And then given you just spoke of the fact that other indigenous peoples run for these offices and they don't win. So something's got to be more at work here than simply ethnic pride, I think. Again, I'm an anthropologist.
You say that's a bad thing.
Okay. That's a very, very good question.
It is.
Go ahead, Rafael.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I didn't want to exclude the poverty factor of the frame. I say one of the most
class. I think there's a difference. Not just poverty, but class. And I think
class, yeah, I'm talking about class. And when I was describing the Bolivian complex society, I said classes are divided ethnic and racially as a consequence of the post-colonial society. So there is a marriage, if you wish, between ethnicity and poverty in Bolivia. 9 out of 10 indigenous are living below the line of poverty. Perhaps I didn't make it stronger, but my point is ethnicity is politicized precisely because it's linked dramatically with poverty, with class.
Yeah.
So I do think class matters in Bolivia, and I do think I'm skeptical of Rafael's claim that Evo could drift over to the right completely and start advocating neoliberal policies, and that he would retain his support among the indigenous population. Because I actually think it's a combination of those factors that have helped Evo do much better than any other indigenous candidate that ran, either in the 90s or in the 2000s. So I think it is the fact that he has this sort of broad array of policies, and I think I actually think it's not just ideology. I think it's not just identity, but I think there's some personal vote here as well. So I think it's a whole range of characteristics. So I do, back to sort of the debate that Rafael and I are having here, is I think one of the key differences here is that we're analyzing different types of data, okay? So the data I'm referring to is individual level survey data, and Rafael is analyzing municipal level data on ethnicity and the vote share. Now, of course, the problem when you're analyzing municipal level data is that, because if you have a 70% population of indigenous in a particular municipality, and you have a 70% vote for Evo, you can't make the assumption that
They're voting.
they're all voting for Evelyn. That is, you have no way of actually deducing who voted for whom. It's called the ecological fallacy. You can't know exactly how they voted the individual level, which is why it is important to look at some individual level data. And so, for example, in my book, analyzing this 2006 lap-up survey, so it showed that, that was taken shortly after the election, and it showed that of Evo's vote, only 28% of the people who voted for him self-identified as indigenous, okay? 43% of the people who voted for him self-identified as mestizo in this survey, but spoke indigenous language. Okay, so these are people that are sort of on the borderline of indigenous and mestizo. That is, they certainly have an indigenous background. They speak an indigenous language in addition to Spanish. But depending on how the question is phrased, they might they might self-identify as an indigenous, Aymara, Quechua, or what have you, or not. And then 19% of Evo's vote came from people who self-identify as mestizos, but only spoke Spanish, don't speak indigenous languages. And then 7% of his vote came from people who self-identify as white. Now, as Rafael alluded to earlier, all of this data on the indigenous population, what percentage it represents, is very much open to dispute, because the numbers you will get on the size of the indigenous population will depend completely on how you phrase the question. So, for example, in the 2001 census data that Rafael referred to, they asked the question, are you Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, and they gave some other indigenous categories. It did not include the choice of mestizo or white. So that's why you get 62% of the population saying, identifying with some of these categories. And many of the people who identified with one of those indigenous categories don't speak indigenous languages and aren't typically people who we would self-identify, who we would identify as indigenous. In other surveys, like the ones that Rafael referred to earlier, where they ask, are you indigenous, mestizo, white, etc., you'll only get about 20%, 25% self-identifying as indigenous. In the recent census, it was, I forget, 46%, something like that, when they phrased the question a little bit differently in that census too. So these, it's not like in the United States where you tend to get fairly consistent numbers in terms of what percentage of the population is African American, what percentage of the population is Latino, etc. Ethnicity in Latin America more generally tends to be very fluid. It will depend on contextual. People think of themselves as indigenous, but they also think of themselves as mestizo, sort of depending on the context. Or they might not think of themselves as indigenous. They're much more likely to identify with these ethno-linguistic categories that Rafael indicated earlier, like Aymara or Quechua, rather than as indigenous. So I remember when I was talking to one, I'm blanking on his name right now, but one former minister in the previous government, in the Loayza administration, he was talking about how one of his good friends, who is, quite white in appearance on the census, said, oh, do you, identify with one of these categories? He checked Aymara because he had some sort of distant Aymara background and there were no other choices. And so I think we can talk about indigenous this or indigenous that, but the fact is all of these categories are much more fluid, the boundaries are much less clear than we might expect.
Rafael, do you want to respond? You have the last word.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It would have been very boring if we didn't have a debate. So thank you very much for the replies. I think this is going very interesting. Well, the first thing I want to say that there is two different things when we are talking about identity. One is racial identity, that is indigenous, mestizo, and whites. Another one is ethnic identity, whether you are Aymara, whether you are Quechua, Guarani, Cirono, or Castellano hablante. What's the difference? Ethnicity is inclusive. Race is exclusive. Nobody wants to be called black, nigger, Indio, but everyone wants to recognize themselves as Aymaras, Quechua. The thing is that we cannot mix both things because they are different. We cannot put together mestizo next to Aymara because are two different things. We have in La Paz mujeres, women, Aymara women that are mestizos, but they are considered themselves Aymaras. They think they have a mestizo race, but with an Aymara ethnicity. And we have whites that consider themselves Aymaras as well, as Raúl pointed out. So we cannot mix those things. And I did a survey in 2004, and I found the same data Selexon did. Just 18% of the Bolivianos in 2004 considered themselves indigenous originarios, racially. But in the same survey, I asked in the next questions whether they consider themselves Aymara, Quechua, Guaranis, and 62%, just as the census, identified themselves with an ethnicity. The thing I'm trying to say is that we don't have to confuse racial identity with ethnic identity, because of course the majority of the Bolivianos consider themselves mestizos. Okay, when I'm talking about ethnicity, I consider the non-indigenous as Castellano hablantes, not in the racial terms, because they are not relevant when it comes to compare vote with ethnicity. So this is not just a presumption or assumption when I'm saying that there is a correlation between the geography of vote and ethnicity, because I did municipality by municipality, and as you can see in these provinces, for example, Aroma, 96% voted for Evo Morales, and 95%, very high. So it's not just that I look at the numbers, but I made correlations geographically. I'm going to show you a map that shows this. El anterior mapa de ahí subite un poquito más. Sí, más, que aparezca un mapa. Yeah, this is the map of the election of 2009 election. Those are the places where Evo Morales won, and this geography matches precise the same geography as ethnic identity in Bolivia, with a margin of error, of course, that I suppose it could be 5%. But when you have such high numbers as the table as I showed before, you must assume that ethnicity has to play a role. And when you cross ethnicity with vote, it matches better than when you match, for example, racial identity, mestizos, blancos, or indigenous with vote. So what I'm saying is that the data that the census of 2001 showed us a geography of identity of Bolivia, it's pretty much more relevant than the other factors used by political scientists, anthropologists, or sociologists to explain the success of Evo Morales. And I can assure you, and we can make a bet here, that in the next election we're going to have the same geography, electoral geography, as the ethnic identity of 2001. So it was not that I just look at the numbers and say, oh yeah, perhaps there's something going on here. I overlap the electoral geography of Evo Morales over the electoral self-identity of the census in 2001.
Okay, we have one more question, and I just have to entertain it because it was tweeted. We have a tweet. We have a question via tweet, so I thought I would ask it. It's a good question by @TyTrainer. So if you're watching, Ty, I hope you're listening. So the question is about how we can argue that Evo's presidency has been marked by socialist tendencies, by greater equality, but nothing that we've talked about so far about promoting indigenous rights has dealt with gender issues. So to what extent has AVO been addressing, in one way or another, the promotion of gender equality alongside ethnic equality, for example, or racial equality? Thank you, Ty.
¿Quién va primero? Who's going first?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. Well, I think gender behavior when it comes to vote is not relevant in Evo Morales. But I have to say that this is a government that made more for women issues, gender issues, than ever before in the past. We have the most relevant and important numbers of MPs and representatives in Congress. We have the more important numbers in public offices, women's in the head of almost half of the Evo Morales cabinet. We have a woman in the electoral court. We have in the justice court. I think if there was an effort of including women, was precisely in Evo Morales' government. But I don't see that women are voting for Evo Morales throughout ethnicity or any other issue.
Right. No, I agree 100% with that. I think there has been progress in terms of representation of women in the legislature, in the cabinet, etc. There was the passage of a law on gender violence recently. Of course, these things are always better on paper than in practice. And I agree. I don't think it's has had any impact to date in terms of the vote. I haven't detected that either from looking at individual level data. And I also wanted to add that I think Rafael and I actually agree much more than we disagree, because I agree 100% in this next election, you're going to see the exact same vote pattern where Evo does much, much better in indigenous areas than in non-indigenous areas. And the rural indigenous people are a central part of his vote, of his base. And they vote for him in higher numbers than any other ethnic group out there. And so I think we can end at least on a note of great consensus.
I agree.
All right, well, thank you both so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. It was very informative.